The grimdark future of the 41st millennium is an incredibly elaborate setting that allows for the exploration of many interesting topics. A part of this that sticks out to me as particularly unique is that the God Emperor of mankind allows for us to explore a human society in a world where there is a real and physical god and one where there is no god at the same time. The Adeptus Sororitas are one of my favourite factions, and as I've been delving into the shelves of the Black Library, I was particularly excited to see what sort of stories came from the religious zealotry and unshakable faith of the Sisters of Battle. The Sisters of Battle novel series by James Swallow consists of 2 novels and a short story / audio drama. It primarily focuses on characters from the Order of Our Martyred Lady. I was looking at James Swallow's website and it turns out there's 2 more stories that I don't discuss here, that is Heart and Soul and Iron and Bone, but as far as I know neither of them are on Audible at the moment, so everything I say here still holds true for the first 3 in the series. The first novel, Faith and Fire, was originally published in 2006. It sees the core cast responsible for hunting down a malicious psyker on the planet Neva, a world primarily managed by the Ecclesiarchy, and eventually uncovering a pretty crazy conspiracy that has gone unnoticed for millennia. The second novel, Hammer and Anvil, released in 2011, which, while I'm not super familiar with the Black Library's publishing habits, seems like a bit of a gap to me. In this, the main protagonist Miria and the others join a reconsecration effort to a distant desert planet following the massacre of the Sororitas by the Necron. It's a bit of a different type of story to the first novel, taking place in a remote setting rather than a heavily populated planet of the Imperium. The final part of the series, Red and Black, also released in 2011. It's a prequel set before Faith and Fire. It follows Miria and her team as they go to a planet populated by replicants that wish to join the Imperium. I'm pretty sure this one was written as an audio drama and then has a novelization of it for the publishing in the 2017 omnibus. Speaking of which, all 3 stories were published together in 2017 as Sisters of Battle, the omnibus. I listened to the audiobook versions of the stories, and the 2 novels are narrated by Emma Gregory. The audio drama is performed by Lisa Bauerman and Beth Chambers. Before I continue, I do consider this series worth the time if you're a fan of the Sororitas, so I will be avoiding spoilers. There is a reoccurring cast of characters through the series. The main protagonist is Sister Miria, which I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce. In the first novel, the narrator pronounces it as Mariah, but in the following stories it's pronounced as Miria. Personally, I prefer the first pronunciation, but I believe Miria is meant to be the canonical pronunciation. Then there's the Sisters Militant, Iona, Cassandra, Isabel, and Lethe, and the Hospitaller Verity. Before I get into discussing my opinions, I should say that I don't have a ton of experience with the Black Library. Prior to this, I had listened to Belisarius Call, great work, and have read some of The Priests of Mars by Graham McNeill. So going into these, I wasn't very familiar with what to expect from the writing style. I will get further into the individual plots of each piece, but in general I really enjoyed these. The highlight for me was definitely the first novel, but all of the stories got me intrigued to want to continue with them, and each is somewhat self-contained. Although the main characters are the same and previous events are often mentioned, each of these stories can be approached on its own, so although it's a series, it's not really a large story spreading over the 3, but rather 3 pieces connected by their characters. The style was not what I was expecting. The focus is definitely on the events and action taking place moment to moment in the story. There's always something happening, whereas I think when I was looking for novels about the Sororitas, I was hoping for something a little more character focused, with deeper exploration of the individual characters' relationship with their own beliefs, like what I got for Call in the great work. Instead, what I got was more of an action comic written as a story, which is perfectly fine, and once I understood what it was and stopped expecting something else, I enjoyed it for what it was. What I'm not sure about is whether that's the general tone of most Black Library content, or something specific to James Swallow's writing. And I do think James Swallow has a talent for this type of writing. I'm not a huge fan of action-heavy books, but with very few exceptions, I was able to easily follow what was happening and not zone out during those battle sections. A particular battle in the first novel has an extended sequence in a tank, and I really enjoyed that, though that could just be because I recently built a Sororitas tank model and was excited to see that show up in the story. The style of writing seemed to favor describing specific parts of battle, and that's what I mean when I say it felt like a novelization of an action comic. There was a lot of describing characters whirling around, performing specific movements, or handling their weapons in particular ways, whereas for me, I personally usually prefer to read about battles from a more zoomed out perspective. I also had some trouble with the environmental descriptions. I had a really hard time visualizing some of the settings, but I could just chalk that up to the fact that 40k has a particularly chaotic visual style, and I think that a lot of writers kind of struggle to convey that in words unless the reader has some sort of official or fan-created image to associate with the description. The narration of the first two novels by Emma Gregory is absolutely exquisite. Brilliant voice work for the characters, each of them sounds unique, but all perfect as the voice of a sister of battle in their own way. I also really enjoyed the way the male characters were narrated. It allows for a lot of flavorful characterization, and it came out in a way that was a bit different to what you're likely to get from a male narrator. I just think that Emma Gregory was the perfect choice for this, and I was excited to see that other Sororitas stories have also been voiced by her. The voice for Miria in particular was absolutely perfect in my opinion. It did seem to alter slightly between the readings of the two novels, but it still kept the same feeling of character. It's difficult for me to say much about the performances in the audio drama, because after listening to one voice narrating these characters for like 20 hours before I listened to it, it was jarring to suddenly have different voices performing the familiar characters. But I do think the performances were good. After a few minutes I got used to the change, and I think the way the characters were performed did a good job of having its own style while building off the characterization given by the Emma Gregory narrations. Faith and Fire is without a doubt my favorite, and probably also the objectively best of the series. It really shows off the qualities of Miria and Verity's characters and allows for a unique perspective into a society even more heavily influenced by the ecclesiarchy than most of the worlds of the Imperium. The antagonist, Taurus Vaughn, didn't grab me at first, but definitely grew on me over time, though I have a feeling I wouldn't have enjoyed the character nearly as much without the way Emma Gregory narrated the character. There is a rather intense and exciting ending. The story leading up to it doesn't always feel like it's going to pay off though. The plot meanders slightly, and although it's all part of the same story, it does feel a bit like just stuff happening and then more stuff happening. The events of the plot do directly connect, but since there's so much time spent on the details of the actions, it can feel a little like the events that do pay off were dwelt on longer than they really needed to be, just for the fun of it spending more time describing the battle, which wasn't something I personally enjoyed, but it's great if that's what you're looking for. If you only check out one of the pieces from the series, I definitely recommend this one. Aside from the tank I mentioned earlier, there was also a section in an Imperial library that I really enjoyed as a bit of a pace breaker between the action. Hammer and Anvil, the second novel, took a bit to grow on me. The initial prologue had me hooked, but even from the first main chapter, we have a few new characters specific to this story, and it was a little while before we get more involved with the appearances from our reoccurring characters. This is kind of understandable since all of these seem to be written with the intention that they can be read in any order. I did enjoy the new characters, but since a large part of what I'd enjoyed about the first novel was the characters, I was mostly just kind of excited to see what happened next for them specifically. So definitely some bias here coming to this after immediately listening to the first novel, remembering that initially it was published several years later, which I'm only just realizing now was a time skip actively worked into the plot by way of having a long journey to the desolate planet of Sanctuary 101 between the books. So while the story still featured several battle scenes, it did have a bit more downtime and even some adventure-y type elements to it that I liked. It also maintained and built on a lot of character development established in the first novel, which I really appreciated. It's clear that the author seemed to want to continue writing these characters as much as I wanted to continue hearing about them. The change in setting to a remote desolate planet made for a very different experience than the first novel, but in a welcome way. Since the characters are the highlight for me, it was just exciting to see them in a different environment. I also think this novel did a much better job of delving into how the Sisters of Battle operate on a galaxy-wide scale, compared to Faith and Fire's more focused look at the internal politics of the ecclesiarchy. The main antagonists in this are the Necrons, which I wasn't super keen on. I think this might have had something to do with the time the novel was released. Maybe the Black Library was really pushing Necrons at that time for some reason. But although the Necron lore is super cool, outside of a few I just don't find them the most interesting characters. In the end it grew on me, and most of the focus still stayed on the Sororitas. Where the first novel really played up the power of the Sororitas, Hammer and Anvil puts them in a position where they're undoubtedly in peril of being absolutely annihilated. So for that reason I can be okay with a few Necrons, because they really help with that setting. A somewhat secondary antagonist is Magos Tagus, who played well off the Sororitas, and again some bias here, since I'm a Mechanicus fan I just really liked having a story where my two favorite factions interact. Personally I would check out Faith and Fire before this and then pick this one up if you enjoyed that and are just looking for another story with the same characters. The prequel, Red and Black, serves as a good character exploration of Miria before the events of the novels. We see her in a position to make a hefty decision that doesn't overhaul or severely recontextualize her existing character from the novels, but does add some context to it that gives us insight into just how much she's already been through before we're ever even introduced to her. Since this is a prequel, it features some characters that didn't reappear from the first novel to the second. I enjoyed it mostly as a prequel. I'm not sure that I would have enjoyed the characters as much if I was coming coming to this first and wasn't already familiar with them. The planet Holos that the sisters visit was an interesting one, and I was surprised with just how much about the world and their society could be conveyed in the short length of the piece. Like Hammer and Anvil, this also featured a member of the Mechanicus as a core character, but it showed a much different relationship between the two factions than they did with Tagus. I really don't have too much to say about this one, since it's so short. I feel that anything I mention will take away a significant part of what you get to experience by listening to it. Ultimately, I think it's a good epilogue to the series, but it probably won't feel too special if it's where you start the series. Since the characters are what holds the series together, I wanted to talk more specifically about some of them. Miria is our primary protagonist through most of the series, and definitely is the character that holds the whole thing together. She's an experienced veteran of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, and shows the steadfast faith of the Sororitas while employing a liberal interpretation of commands from her superiors. She's righteous but reasonable, and I think that makes for a rather grounded main character in a story that's full of the hyper-religious members of the Imperium. The Hospital of Verity was a brilliant and necessary addition to the main cast. Having that alternative point of view to just the sisters militant kept things refreshing, and the relationship between her and Miria was a highlight of both of the first two novels. It was also cool to get a bit of insight into the Orders Hospitaller, which are a part of the Sororitas I was aware of but not super familiar with. I'm putting Cassandra and Isabel together because they both fill similar roles. They're there, it seems to me, to be kind of a steady ground of support for Miria. Neither of them have a ton of lines in any of the stories, but at the same time, their consistent presence is something familiar and comforting. As a side note, I really liked the voice Emma Gregory used for Cassandra, definitely my favorite of any of the voices in the series. The next two characters I'm putting together because to talk about either of them, I need to spoil the first couple of chapters of the first novel. Hopefully, if you've made it this far, you've either already read the series, or if not, maybe skip this section, as although they're minor spoilers for early in the series, I do think it's worth finding out for yourself through the story for the first time. So here we go. Lethe and Iona. Lethe's killed very early in Faith and Fire, and Iona is sentenced to the Repentia. Although neither of them reappear in the second novel, I appreciated that they weren't forgotten. Their fates are an ongoing influence on Miria's character, and although their appearances were minor, their impact on the story is felt throughout the entire series, which is why I still feel the need to mention them. This is also why I recommend experiencing the series in release order, as in the prequel, Iona and Lethe are still present, and this has a much different feeling once you know what will happen. Since you've probably seen it enough by now, I should probably quickly mention the cover art. Both of the novels have relatively plain art, but it has a consistent visual style. The Faith and Fire cover is by Karl Kopinski, and it's my favorite of the three. I'm not a huge fan of the style done by Hardy Fowler for Hammer and Anvil. It's not bad, it's just not what I look for in my Warhammer art. Red and Black's cover art is by Sloromir Manyak, sorry for the pronunciation. It's good quality, but it didn't stick out to me as much as the novel's cover art did. It's used as the cover for both the audio drama and the omnibus release. So to be honest, none of these covers look like what I look for in Sororitas 40k art. The image that I'll always associate with the Sisters of Battle is the illustration of Canoness Viridian by John Blanche. To me, that just embodies perfectly what the Sororitas are. Writing, 3.5 out of 5. Narration, 5 out of 5. Read or not read? Read. I'm calling this a read, but with the caveat that I think that it may not be the most exciting one if you're not either already a fan of the Sororitas or really looking for a Sororitas story. So read if you're specifically looking for a Sisters of Battle novel, which I guess kind of should go without saying. I can't recommend going for the omnibus straight up. I definitely recommend just starting by checking out Faith and Fire to see if you enjoy it. Or if you want something shorter, Red and Black comes relatively cheap by comparison to the novels, and the audio drama version runs just over an hour. It works as a self-contained piece, though I will say that I don't think the audio drama has the same impact if you're not already familiar with the characters, as there's not much time to get to know them. Definitely a more satisfying piece if you experience it after already going through the events that Miria will face in the future. I don't think this is necessarily the greatest work out there in the Black Library, but it's by no means bad. I do think that currently it's the most definitive Sororitas series. I wanted to talk about this and not another story like The Great Work, because while this one's a bit dated, I still think it's absolutely worth your time. If you're a Sororitas fan or you're looking for a novel series to introduce you to them, give this one a go. I really enjoy these characters, and I'd love to see more stories about them, though I'm not sure that will happen. Miria and Verity I would love to see brought into like the larger 40k canon. That these characters, along with Cassandra, Isabel, Lethe, and Iona, grow on me so much over the time with the series is one of the major factors in making me want to talk about it. If you've already read it, or you do after watching this video, I'd be keen to hear what you have to say about it. Like I said, I'm a bit new to the Black Library content, so I'm still learning what to expect, and I'm interested to hear what other people's experiences with it have been. Thank you very much to everyone who stuck around this far into the video. I do intend to release more 40k content, not just about the Black Library, but Warhammer TV, the miniatures, and the greater lore in general. If you think you'd be interested in any of that, or you just want to help me out, subscribe to the channel, and we can explore this grim dark future together.